Just one moment while I share my screen with you. Let's see. There it is.
Over to Dr. John.
Yes, John. Yes, John. Please share the screen.
Okay, there we go. Okay, fantastic.
The screen is visible.
Okay, very good. Can you hear me clearly and see the screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to my keynote presentation entitled Giba Jagi Binji, With Fire in Your Belly, Fire Ecologies and Human Nature Entanglements in Recent Aboriginal Australian Poetry of the Last Decade. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the Widjabal people of the Bundjalung Nation, on whose land lies the Lismore campus of Southern Cross University. And I also acknowledge the Yawaru people of Broome, Western Australia, the location of the Nulungu Institute of the University of Notre Dame. I recognize the significant role the past and future elders play in the life of these universities and regions, and I am mindful that the land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It is my great honor and privilege to be with you today, and I extend my sincere thanks to all members of the organizing committee, and in particular, Professor Suja Kurup, Director of the Center for Australian Studies at the University of Kerala, for her kind invitation to speak today. The title of my presentation, well, the first part, quotes from Minjerribah poet Sasham Parkin Owens, his poem, My Ancestors, included in Firefront, a recent poetry anthology, which I will discuss in a moment. But I think the image of or the metaphor of fire in your belly offers a means as well of understanding artwork of the colonial era. And on the screen here, you have a panoramic view of King George's Sound, part of the Swan River colony. That's a hand-colored print created in 1834 by Robert Havell, based on sketches by Robert Dale. An incredibly panoramic work that's worth looking up. It consists of about 12 panels. And the two panels shown here depict relations between settlers and Aboriginal people in the southwest region of Western Australia. Now, for Aboriginal people, fire has been central to sustaining human relations as well as to managing the landscape over many thousands of years. And so as we see at the right side of the painting, there's the hearth, the fire, as an instrument of conviviality and social relations. But then if we look in the panorama, we see a landscape that has been modified by fire over many thousands of years. And so you can approach colonial painting of this kind through the perspective of fire that the landscape celebrated in art of the 19th century in particular, and into the modern era less so. But certainly in the 19th century, those are landscapes that have been modified carefully and ingeniously by Aboriginal people over many years. But these haunting images of Malakuta, a small coastal town in the East Gippsland region of Victoria, Australia, remind us of fire's inherent potential for destruction and for calamity. These images capture just one traumatic moment of the broad-scale crisis that befell Australia during the 2019 to 20 bushfire season known as the Black Summer. From July of 19 to March of 2020, that's winter to autumn in Australia, more than 11,000 conflagrations devastated approximately 20 million hectares of country. And the total number of deaths was 33 human and an estimated 1 billion non-human animals. And indeed, in the media of that time, there were lots of images of kangaroos and wallabies and other animals being rescued by workers and citizens. The conditions that conspired to cause this tragedy, exacerbated by prolonged drought, were, according to the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, those associated with human-induced climate change. Indeed, globally, the decade 2010 to 2019 was the warmest on record, 8 of the 10 hottest known years occurring during this period. So the first half of 2020 saw an abundance of stories in international and Australian news media outlets about Aboriginal management of the environment through the application of fire as a tool. And for instance, this story in Time comments that, quote, the recent surge in interest in Indigenous fire management is an implicit sign that many Australians recognize the value of what was very nearly lost. So in the presentation, I would like to give you an indication of how recent Aboriginal poetry has been addressing environmental crises of various kinds, including the bushfire crisis. And I then would like to introduce you to some frameworks for reading Aboriginal poetry eco-critically, and then look more generally at human nature with a particular emphasis on tree entanglements in Aboriginal poetry with some literary and artistic examples. I'll give you a brief introduction to Aboriginal cultural burning and fire ecology, and then I'll give you 2 perspectives from recent Aboriginal poetry on human-fire relations, 2 poems showing both sides of the coin, fire as an element of within harmonious relations to the environment, and fire as an element gone wrong and used inappropriately. And then some further reading. So looking at recent Aboriginal Australian poetry, it's a vibrant area, and the work of Ali Colby-Eckermann is part of this fluorescence of Aboriginal poetry of the last decade, and we'll return to Eckermann's work in a moment. But of course, Aboriginal poetry is grounded in oral traditions and song poetry, so sung narratives, with a more than 60,000-year lineage. So it's arguably the oldest literary tradition known. Now, Aboriginal poetry as a whole tends to reverberate with ethnobiological allusions. So those references to traditional culture that show the integration of the human in nature, the embedded relationship. And these allusions are often embedded in dreaming or creation narratives. Those are the traditional stories of Aboriginal cultures about the origins of humans and plants and animals, the earth, the cosmos, and so forth. Aboriginal poetry, despite its incredible lineage, emerged as a contemporary textual phenomenon, really with Utru Nunakal's or Kath Walker's We Are Going from 1964. So it's both a very, Aboriginal poetry is both a very ancient and a very new literary genre. But active poets, especially of the last decade, include Janine Lean, Ali Colby-Eckermann, Lionel Fogarty, Ellen Van Nerven, and Curly Saunders, the work of whom demonstrate the spectrum of styles of Aboriginal poetry that have emerged in recent years. So a recent anthology of note is called Firefront, and I encourage you to have a look if you can. It's a collection of 53 poems by poets from different generations. So it includes poems by Nunakal and Jack Davis, for example, from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but also very new poetry by young poets like Parkin Owens. And the editor, Alison Whitaker, herself a poet, comments that it's a cliche to say that Indigenous poetry is powerful. From where does that power come? Like Firefront, does it come from challenging and subverting the English language or the poetic forms and traditions of the West? Or does it come from creating space for other ways of thinking and rethinking and returning to proper thought? Does it nurture its Indigenous readers? I would argue that it performs all of the above simultaneously in many ways. This is a poem from Parkin Owens, My Ancestors, which I referenced in the title of my presentation. And it first appeared in the journal Overland in 2017, and it went on to receive the 2017 Udro Nunukal Poetry Prize, an annual prize. Now, Parkin Owens is a 21-year-old Aboriginal and African American poet whose indigenous ties come from Minjerribah, or North Stradbroke Island, Queensland, alternating between English and indigenous languages. You can see the refrain of the poem is Ginjagiba Narayuba, and elsewhere different refrains, Gananyayi and Nyaridegi, I am your ancestor. This movement between indigenous languages and English is a common feature of many Aboriginal poems. And in the poem, the act of writing is described as ancestral, but also a means to invoke one's ancestors in the present. And you see Kiba Jagi Binji with fire in your belly. The fire becomes a medium, as we'll see in other poetry and art, a medium for dialogue with the ancestors. Now, the term Gabi Jagi Binji with fire in your belly signifies the material and metaphorical, corporeal and spiritual dimensions of fire balanced by Aboriginal societies. And that's important to remember as we think about who caused the bushfires, that for Aboriginal cultures, fire has multiple resonances. It's a material reality, but also a strong metaphorical, metaphysical, and spiritual entity in itself. Another anthology of note is this one, Guwaya, Guwayu for All Times, also appearing in 2020. Gawayu is a Wajiri word meaning still and yet and for all times. And it includes poetry that's been commissioned by Red Room Poetry, a very active organization in Australian poetry. And it brings this work together, 63 poems, 36 Aboriginal poets in 12 Indigenous Australian languages. So a very significant publication within the last decade of Australian Aboriginal poetry activities. The editor, Janine Lean, a poet in her own right, comments that the Australian literary landscape needs this bold, brave intervention to wake it from the 232-year slumber in the dream of the settler mythscape. Guwayu breaks the silence, feel our beauty, feel the beauty, hear our words. Okay, so it's an entreaty for Aboriginal poetry to reach a broader readership and to have more impact. Now here is Lean reading her poem, Country Speaks, and I'd like to share this with you if you'd bear with me for one moment while I share the screen.
It's been too long since I sat on granite in my country and thought. Too many years since I breathed this air. Bungiying, Gunha, felt this dirt. Nagambian, Daragan, smelt this dust. Bara, Ning, Barang. Listened for the sound of her words to say, Balandaha, Durahai, Burmal, Yia, Yingi, Wambe, Yarrabing. History does not have the first claim, nor the last word. Nikimi, Yara, Delungabul, Ningianghai, Gingu. You can speak us now. Thank you.
Okay. Oops. All right. Great. Okay, so important to hear Aboriginal poetry being read by the author. All right, so one of the ways in which we can think about Aboriginal poetry in a scholarly fashion is through eco-criticism. And I'd like to introduce you to a few frameworks. I noticed in the program, there's lots of interest in eco-criticism and environmental writing in Australia. And so I'd like to review some of the current theory and directions in eco-critical scholarship. The term environmental text is one that refers to any novel, film, poem, article, even an advertisement that represents the environment, ecological issues, and or human nature relations. So this is a term defined initially by Lawrence Buell in the mid-1990s as a text in which, quote, the non-human environment is present not merely as a framing device, but as a presence, right? So the non-human environment becomes an agent in the text. Now, eco-criticism is the literary and historical analysis of environmental texts of various kinds. And famously, the scholar Cheryl Glotfelty in 1996 defined eco-criticism in this way, and I still think it holds true. She defined it as the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment, demonstrating an earth-centered approach to literary studies. Since the 1990s, the intervening 26 or so years, eco-criticism has diversified into numerous specializations, such as effective and even empirical studies. There's a branch called empirical ecosystem, eco-criticism that's worth looking at. Now, in the Australian context, a major work of eco-criticism was the 2007 publication, The Littoral Zone by Cranston and Zeller. But last year, the book Eco-Critical Concerns in the Australian Continent emerged or was published as well. So it's a vibrant area. In my own review of eco-criticism as globally practiced, I identify a number of emerging areas of focus, including climate change, more urgently COVID-19 and pandemics, and the broad designation of the Anthropocene as the current era we live in, as well as affective, post-colonial, zoo-critical, phytocritical, and even eco-media orientations to eco-criticism. And I'd be happy to make a version of this article available to anyone interested. In addition to Cranston and Zeller's The Littoral Zone from 2007, arguably the first in-depth publication on Australian eco-criticism, there is also Brian Elliott's The Landscape of Australian Poetry from 1967. This is a proto-eco-critical study, and I was pleased to learn that the book is freely available on archive.org if you're interested. It's a really interesting work from the perspective of environmental criticism in Australia. Now, eco-poetics is another term that you'll come across. It tends to refer to poetry that expresses ecological values, critiques environmental degradation, and upholds an ethics of the natural world. So it looks at eco-poetry. It's often associated with contemporary environmental activism and advocacy, and that's what distinguishes eco-poetry from nature poetry. Eco-poetry is concerned with pressing environmental problems. Nature poetry, in contrast, relates to the British Romanticism tradition and the pastoral legacy, whereas landscape poetry tends to refer to that which focuses on aesthetic appreciation of the visual features of an environment. Wordsworth, for example, wrote both nature poetry and landscape poetry. But we can think of eco-poetics more broadly as a mode of literary analysis in which we understand any poem from an ecological perspective, right? So we can conduct an eco-poetic reading of a poem that's not necessarily or ostensibly about the environment. And then the third dimension of eco-poetics is its significance to describe environmental activism, focused on sustainability, conservation, and human nature balance. And so we can talk about an eco-poetic community initiative, for example, that has very little to do with actual poetry. Animals in literature is also a dynamic area. The term animal text refers to those representing animal life and human-animal relations. Zoo criticism can be understood as the reading of literary text through an animal-focused lens. And this area emerged really from animal ethics debates in the broader scholarly field of human-animal studies over the last 50 years. Now, plants in literature has emerged in response to animals in literature in order to define plant texts as those representing plant life and human-plant relations. And phytocriticism is that critical practice of examining literary text through a plant-focused lens. And this area emerged from plant ethics debates and a broader interdisciplinary field known as human-plant studies. In the Australian context, there's been recent work in these areas, especially with Iris Ralph's Packing Death in Australian Literature, published last year, and my own Plants in Contemporary Poetry, published a few years ago. Okay, so turning now to human nature entanglements in Aboriginal Australian poetry, literary artistic views, and with an emphasis on trees. The flower pictured here is that of the West Australian Christmas tree, Nutsia floribunda is its scientific name. It's regarded as the world's largest parasitic tree and one whose flowering in December each year signifies the season of Biruk, also known as the first summer, and the season of heat, dryness, and fire. And here is the 6-season calendar of the Noongar people of Southwest Australia, including the season Biruk, shown at the bottom left, roughly encompassing the months of December and January. It's the season when this tree flowers in this brilliant orange and yellow corona or regal appearance. This is a season in which fire becomes more prominent in the landscape and during which Aboriginal people of the Southwest would manage fire in a careful way. In Australia, as you know, an island continent highly vulnerable to climate change, the clearance of ancient trees still goes on as part of the neo-colonial state that Australia is. On rare occasions, there have been attempts to transplant trees, such as the famous Gijajumulu, a boab tree trucked 3,200 kilometers, incredible, from the Kimberley region of Western Australia to Perth. Weighing approximately 36 tons or 79,000 pounds and estimated to be 750 years old, the boab was removed and replanted to make way for the construction of a road bridge in the Kimberley. This operation, occurring in 2008, is considered the longest land journey of a tree of its size known in history. Now, I visited the tree in 2016, and although bruised from the long trip, initially very bruised, and in fact still recovering 8 years later in 2016, the tree was assessed as healthy by botanists, and yet the tree always struck me as out of place in the Mediterranean urban climate of Perth, almost like a lonely transplant from another region of Australia. Poet Bill Niji's story about feeling is an extended dialogue between the author and his tree ancestors who taught him to live in balance with the land. It's also a story about Niji's desire to pass his deep knowledge of culture and environment to younger generations of Aboriginal people. In the following excerpt, Niji admonishes a young man for recklessly chopping down an ancient tree. And he says, "Yes, I chop it down, that big tree. I play, I cut it, yes. You cutted it yourself? When you get, about 50, you'll feel it. Pain on your back because you cutted it." Written in Aboriginal English, a dialect used throughout Australia, the lines speak of the physical implications of cutting the big tree down when you get, about 50, so about 50 years old. You feel it on your back, right? So in other words, humans and trees are physically, corporeally, and as we'll see, spiritually co-implicated. Painter Albert Namajira's watercolor Ghost Gum McDonald Ranges from 1945 depicts a solitary gum tree with two trunks atop a rocky outcrop in the McDonald Range near Alice Springs in Central Australia. Contorted by the elements, the tree is adapted perfectly to the arid environment and is a non-human kin of local Aboriginal people. But thinking about the theme of the conference of fire and bushfires, tragically, however, two ghost gums painted by Namajira were recently found toppled over and burned, victims of a suspected arson. Due to their prominence in Namajira's artwork, these trees were soon due to be listed in Australia's National Heritage Register. This is an example from an Aboriginal worldview of the element of fire becoming imbalanced through inappropriate use. Artist Bella Kelly's work, mostly focused on the southwest region of Australia, features landscapes undergoing various stages of transformation from bushland to agriculture. In this untitled landscape from the 1960s, gum trees frame the right side of the composition near a cluster of grass trees in the middle. The fence in the foreground and the cattle to the left signify processes of pastoral transformation. Pockets of trees in the distance represent the increasing ecological fragmentation of the landscape, a condition exacerbated by the infrequency of Noongar burning since colonization. Nunakal's poem, a quite famous poem in fact, Municipal Gum, is an elegy addressed to an urban gum tree. The poem reveals a worldview shared among Aboriginal cultures of trees as encompassed within a network of human to non-human kinship relations. The repercussions of settler colonialism, however, impinge upon the gum's physical vitality in the degraded landscape. The poem reads, "Gum tree in the city street, hard bitumen around your feet." The narrator communicates empathy for the gum by drawing comparisons between human and tree anatomies in images such as your feet. Later, the gum appears castrated, broken, with a hung head and listless mien, signifying its isolation and hopelessness. Although a fellow citizen, tree has become an outlier, estranged from its own ancestral ecological network. The poem's final question calls attention to the interspecies trauma of Australian colonialism. What have they done to us? Oh, fellow citizen, what have they done to us, right? Activist and poet Lionel Fogarty's Black Gum Trunk from 1982 attempts to recuperate Aboriginal understandings of tree life and put them into verse form. His use of the four-syllable phrases, "hey, him silly," and "him life finished" at the end of the poem evokes the friction between Anglo-European and Aboriginal Australian perceptions of trees. As is evident in much Australian poetry, there's an element of mimicry. In this sense, the poem mimics the dominant Anglo-Australian view of talking with trees as silliness, as confined to the domain of myths, folklore, or popular culture. Human-tree relations in the poem are mediated through the senses of taste and touch, as well as a kind of empathetic bodily identification, laid, spread out, poor gum, trunk done. As evident in other poems by Aboriginal poets, the image of the tree symbolizes the ravages of colonialism, but also the desire, the tree's desire, and the Aboriginal writer's desire to create contact with the tree through the medium of poetry. Jack Davis's poem Forest Giant shows the great extent to which trees provided a sense of belonging, comfort, and identification to the poet. Published in 1992, the poem opens with a direct address. "You have stood there for centuries, arms gaunt, reaching for the sky, your roots in cadence with the heartbeat of the soil." So these lines evoke the deep temporality of Australian trees in the Aboriginal worldview. The tree is a sentient presence, arms gaunt, reaching for the sky, but it's also a witness to ecocide, devastation of the land. And the poem affirms the entanglements between human and tree lives in lines such as now you and I bleed in sorrow and in silence. And in the final lines, the desecration of the tree's body is likened to the defilement of the female body. Like Nunaco's municipal gum, Lisa Bellier's Beautiful Oak Red River gum is about urban trees, those trees that remain as, quote, survivors of genocide who watch and camp out, live, breathe in various parks around Fitzroy being a suburb of Melbourne. The native trees are cleared for urban infrastructure and replaced by imported trees from Europe. As seen in other examples of Aboriginal poetry, the images of the trees evoke the ecocide, beginning with colonization in the late 18th century, but persisting into the present through forms of neo-colonial expansion. Now, Bellier references a scarred tree which overlooks the Melbourne cricket ground. And although this allusion suggests environmental vandalism, it also evokes the extensive cultural tradition of dendroglyphs, or carved trees, as seen in these images. For Aboriginal societies, the ceremonial carving of trees has offered a form of artistic and cultural expression for many thousands of years. Peter Minter is a very active poet whose poem, it's a kind of ode, in fact, the tree extends the tradition within Aboriginal poetry of the tree as a subject of poetic address. As also seen in the poetry of Jack Davis, Minter's trees are subjects worthy of regard, of poetic regard, and the poem opens with, "What am I, the tree, who stands before thee, just as thee art tree for me, or I am thee." And so there's a blending of subjectivities between the speaker and the tree, and that demonstrates human interdependencies with trees. And the last poem I'll present in this section is Story Tree, a very recent poem and a very interesting one, an epistolary poem, presumably based on email exchanges between Joy Harjo, a Native American poet and the incumbent US poet laureate, and Aboriginal Australian poet Ali Colby Eckermann of South Australia. So the narrator in Harjo's part of the poem reflects on her son who labors on the railroads. And Eckermann replies in this way: "There are no trains here. The railway lines have been removed. The station house vacant in disrepair. I wait by the broken platform for my son's return. There is no view of him. I no longer know where he lives." Eckermann's personal reflection shifts into an ecological tone as she considers the millions of trees demolished to build the railway. Now barely a tree survives. Yet the old trees hold memories. And yet again, we see how trees become witnesses to ecocide in Australia. Now, turning now to Aboriginal cultural burning and fire ecology, here is an image of Gija rangers conducting prescribed burning in East Kimberley of Western Australia. And this kind of practice has become a focus of much research and media coverage since the bushfire tragedies. Cultural burning, as it's called, is a motif in Australian art of the colonial era. Painter Joseph Lycett, who was transported to New South Wales in 1813 as a convicted forger, created this painting in 1817, Aborigines Using Fire to Hunt Kangaroos. It's an example of landscape painting in which Aboriginal people are depicted in hunting kangaroos, but also in managing the environment with fire in a pre-colonial space considered untouched by European settlement. And this motif of the fire persists in other ways in Lycett's work. This is his corroboree at Newcastle from 1818, the first known European oil painting to depict a nighttime corroboree by Aboriginal people. And we see here the role of fire as a medium of social and cultural cohesion, evident throughout the painting's foreground and also in the panoramic painting I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. Within Aboriginal art itself, however, fire is implicated in dreaming narratives. Clifford Possum's Warlulong Warlukulong from 1917 narrates the story of an ancestral being named Lungkata, starting the first bushfire in the world. So the painting refers to 9 distinct dreamings, of which Lungkata's tale is the central dreaming, the central narrative. Lungkata was the blue-tongued lizard man, a dreaming figure responsible for creating bushfire to punish his 2 sons who did not share with their father the kangaroo they had caught. The sons' skeletons are on the right side of the painting against a background of smoke and ashes. And so we can see how closely related fire and kangaroos are in this dreaming painting. Many of Clifford Possum's subsequent works, like Fire Dreaming, depicted here from 1988, show dreaming narratives involving fire. At the viewer's bottom left corner, the painting evokes the regeneration of plant foods through cultural burning. And recent works such as Barbara Weir's Fire Dreaming from 2015 also address the role of fire. And Weir comments that, quote, "I paint my mother's country, the land where we live, find, and prepare our food. I paint the same old stories I heard as a child." Weir's work underscores how fire, as a persona in itself, remains integral to those old stories. And furthermore, artist Jorna Newberry's Waru Jukorpa, or Fire Dreaming, narrates the use of fire for hunting and land management on traditional Aboriginal lands. The story relates to Jorna's mother's country at Utanja, near the intersection of 3 boundaries of state boundaries: Western Australia, Northern Territory, and South Australia. In the painting, the land featured in white is being burnt off in a controlled manner, while the swirling areas of red signify the bushfire and the effects of the wind on the bushfire. The terms fire stick farming and cultural or cool burning, and I've even come across the term cold burning in the Noongar tradition of Southwest Australia. All these terms refer to the regular traditional burning of vegetation to facilitate hunting, to change species composition, control weeds, increase biodiversity, and so forth. The term fire stick farming, which isn't used to a great extent anymore, was devised in the 1960s by archaeologist Rhys Jones to account for the active management of ecosystems by Aboriginal communities through burning that encourages the growth of certain species and suppresses the growth of others. These are known as systems of patch mosaic firing, and used in conjunction with small game hunting, this system has maintained biodiversity over time. So low intensity mosaic fires applied at particular times of year to manage the landscape. A recent example of restoring cultural burning practices comes from the Korna community of Adelaide. In May of this year, the City of Adelaide partnered with the Korna community, Green Adelaide, an organization, and the National Parks and Wildlife Service of South Australia to deliver a pilot burn in Adelaide's southeastern parklands, which is a response to the bushfire tragedy. It's this recuperation of traditional firing practices within city parklands. That's a very significant development. Despite the deliberate and strategic nature of the practice, some colonial Australian observers regarded cultural burning as indiscriminate and even disorganized. For instance, in the 1790s, the naturalist Archibald Menzies described, and I quote, "the busy, capricious disposition of the natives who are fond of kindling frequent fires round their huts," end quote. Sylvia Hallam called attention to these early misconceptions in her classic work, Fire and Hearth, originally published in 1975, one of the first in-depth studies of Aboriginal firing practices. You may be familiar with historian Bill Gamage's The Biggest Estate on Earth, a study that extends the work and builds on the work of Hallam and Jones, and published in 2012. And Gamage remarks in a similar tone to Hallam and other researchers that knowing which plants welcome fire and when and how much was critical to managing land. Plants could then be burnt and not burnt in patterns so that post-fire regeneration could situate and move grazing animals predictably by selectively locating the feed and shelter they prefer. And more recently, there's been Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, suggesting the use of fire by Aboriginal Australians as early as 120,000 years ago. Pascoe comments that the dominant method was a mosaic pattern of low-level burns. Pascoe is an Aboriginal scientist, so this is an important perspective that he brings. He comments that almost all early European visitors to Australia remarked on the frequency of small-scale burning, as we saw in the paintings earlier in the presentation. And Pascoe delineates 5 features of this burning, mosaic burning practice. The first is that its composition is as a rotating mosaic, a low-intensity fire in a small patch-like area that's rotated frequently in order to avoid too much of an intense impact on the land. An awareness of the seasons is critical. In the Noongar tradition, burning occurred during particular seasons. Awareness of the weather, communication with neighboring people, neighboring cultural groups and tribes, and the avoidance of plants' growing season in order to not destroy the plant regenerative capacity. Now, starting to wind up here, I'd like to return to Aboriginal Australian poetry and human-fire relations, because fire is a relationship. When we think of cultural burning, it implies a relationship to fire, a traditional ancestral relationship put into practice in the present. Aboriginal poetry of the last decade reveals an abiding commitment among Indigenous people to land and culture. Poets such as Lionel Fogarty, seen here, keep the flame of the poet-activist tradition of Nunakal and Davis. They keep that flame alive and burning through readings and publications and activist work. So I'd like to conclude with 2 poems offering contrastive views of fire. That is, on the one hand, fire as an element of cultural and environmental balance, and on the other, fire as an agent of destruction and suffering. And I'd like to begin with the latter. So that's Ali Kobe Eckermann's poem. It's a visual or concrete poem, Thunder Raining Poison, featured here. A poem that confronts the impact of nuclear testing on her traditional lands at Maralinga, South Australia, by the British government from the 1940s through the 60s, for over 2 decades. In the shape of a bomb, the poem expresses the trauma of neocolonialism in Australia, especially the pernicious assumption of terra nullius, right, the land as an empty and unoccupied space, the myth of terra nullius. Eckermann makes use of questions and repetition, as we see throughout the poem, repetition of the number 2000, and did you hear it, right? That bomb, the torture of red sand turning green, the anguish of earth turned to glass, did you hear it? 2000. And she goes on to explain that 2000 is also the estimated number of lives lost. The final 3 lines, not included here for lack of space, read 2000, once again, that powerful number, 2000, 2000 or more. Our hearts grow as we mourn for our land. It's part of us. We love it, poisoned and all. So Eckermann evokes the extreme peril of when fire becomes out of balance, disrespected even, in the form of the atom bomb. In fact, the symptom of settler society's larger, distorted relationship to fire. In contrast, Yuyu Korobura, Fire is Burning, from 2018 by poet-activist Alice Ether, addresses the capacity of fire to heal and reconcile long-standing cultural divisions. As a woman of both Aboriginal and European ancestry, Ether must negotiate the deep fractures lingering in post-colonial society. She writes, "Sitting in the middle of this collision, my mission is to bring 2 divided worlds to sit beside the fire and listen. Through the skin, I know where I belong. It is both my center and my division. Yuyu Kara Pura fire is burning. My ancestors dance in the stars, and their tongues are in the flames, and they tell me, you have to keep the fire alive. I believe this is a powerfully hopeful note to end on, and so I'll end my presentation there. But before doing so, I'd like to uh, invite you to some further reading. For those of you conducting environmental cultural research on Australian topics, these are some of the books I've authored or edited, either wholly or partly devoted to issues of culture and ecology in Australia. And my recent co-authored book, as Dr. Suja mentioned, Introduction to the Environmental Humanities. In fact, it's released today, right? So it deals extensively with Australian theorists, writers, places, issues, and case studies, including the importance of Aboriginal Australian ecological knowledge. And also for your interest, some recent contributions to books that I've made, each of which has an emphasis on the Australian environment, but from different perspectives, from the perspective of the environmental humanities, from the perspective of life writing, post-colonial literature, the philosophy of the seasons, ideas of wilderness, ideas of loss in the Anthropocene, and also an emerging area known as geopoetics. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I do hope we have time for some questions. So thank you very much for the chance to speak to you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ryan, for that enlightening session. You had given us part of your presentation one acrylic painting by Barbara Ware, The Dreaming.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We too have a print of some dot paintings in our center. So Barbara Ware, does she do some dot painting as well?
I believe so. Yes, I do believe she works in a number of styles and media. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Versatile painter.
Okay,
Yeah.
my query does not have direct connection with the presentation, but I was struck by the dot painting, which was submerged in the kind of acrylic painting that she had done. That's why this question.
Yes. Certainly the art of the past decade among Aboriginal people has shown a kind of blending of styles, and also there's multimedia and experimental work. And so I think that's in part why you see the traditional interfacing with the very contemporary in terms of art, so the dot painting style mixing with acrylics and other forms of painting. So that's why, yeah, it's interesting to look at the Aboriginal painters, say, of the 60s and 70s, and then look at the work of the last decade. It's an interesting contrastive view of how art has evolved among Aboriginal painters and artists. Yeah, thanks for the comment.
Yeah, at the center and at the University of Kerala, students are familiar with Aboriginal playwrights, Kevin Gilbert and Jack Davis. But it was from your talk that we gained much knowledge and information, in fact, about Aboriginal poetry, and that too, the recent ones. I think we stopped somewhere at Udru Nunukal's We Are Going, because it's a much anthologized poem. We have included in our Kerala University syllabus quite recently, but not beyond that. So thank you so much for that updating, which was much needed.
Oh, fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm glad that you're looking at Aboriginal poetry, and I hope
so.
to continue to.
Yeah. Are there any observations or questions directed to Dr. John? Do you have something to ask? Okay.
Hello, sir. I just wanted to make an observation and a question that just popped into my head. First of all, we were talking about eco-poetry, and I was thinking literature is not merely the depiction of life, but literature can be an agent of change. And when we have concepts like we were talking about ancestral carvings. Then we have the things like direction trees in Australia. Like you were saying, they are not merely corporeally but physically connected with the lives of the people. As such, I was thinking this could be leveraged to make a change. As in, this could be leveraged as a potent tool of how climate change can be prevented. How we could use this indigenous, not just the knowledge but the emotional part of it to address climate change. That was one thing I was thinking, and what I wanted to know was. In this right now we have a lot of interdisciplinary studies going on. So as far as the Australian Aboriginal burning practices are concerned, I wanted to know whether there has been kind of any scientific study as to the efficacy of these being able to prevent bushfires, any such thing.
Yes, great question. And I showed the Aboriginal cultural bearer lighting a fire in his hands in the parkland of Adelaide. That's a significant development because a lot of cultural burning has been conducted in national parks where there's wide open land, such as the Kimberley or in the Northern Territory around Alice Springs and so forth. But to bring the cultural practices into cities marks an even greater interest in traditional knowledge of fire. There have been studies, and they've been conducted from different perspectives. There's the ecological science perspective of how fire can be managed in the long term through traditional burning. There's the ethnobiological or even ethnobotanical perspective, how fire helps to promote certain species that are good bush tucker, good for eating, good for medicine, and so forth. There's the policy and implementation side, so looking at how to implement traditional burning practices within current laws and policies and regulations. Then there's the anthropological side, or even the social science side, sociological, and the environmental justice side that shows how the restoration of cultural burning can promote stronger Aboriginal identity and perhaps lead to greater cultural cohesion and sovereignty and so forth among Aboriginal people. So yes, there have been scientific, social scientific, and also literary and humanistic studies of firing practices since Rhys Jones in the 1960s, who was an archaeologist, and then Sylvia Hallam was an archaeologist as well. Gamage is an historian, and Bruce Pascoe is an Aboriginal writer generally about Aboriginal topics. So yeah, it's truly an interdisciplinary study, and yeah, becoming more important since the bushfire tragedies. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Hi. Hello, Professor Ryan. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. This is Devashri Dattare. I'm very grateful to Professor Suja and her team for organizing this event. I had a simple question, which is that I was wondering if, in terms of collaboration, especially with respect to indigenous knowledge systems, have there been collaborations with respect to that with other communities, maybe in North America, for instance, with Aboriginal communities? And I was wondering if you could tell us that. And yes, would love to read your recent work on eco-criticism, BS that you mentioned. So
Sure.
yeah, so if you could, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, there have been collaborations over many years, beginning in the 60s, between Aboriginal activists, scholars, writers, and other individuals, and not only Native American communities, but also South Pacific communities, because Australia is so close to nations such as Fiji and elsewhere in the South Pacific, New Zealand with Maori people. Those collaborations really received much attention with Nunakau's work. Nunakau underwent a period where she was very global, where she traveled to China, the US, perhaps India. I'm not sure about that exactly, but yeah, and I think that helped to promote the idea of the writer activist tradition in Aboriginal Australia. That still continues. In fact, there's a project on yarning. Yarning is a traditional Aboriginal practice of basically sitting in a circle with other people and discussing issues, a respectful manner of yarn. They call it yarning. And in fact, that method has been applied by researchers in various other cultural contexts as a way to respectfully engage with, what ethnography would otherwise call informants, which is a very cold term, or participants, which is better. So there's been extensive work also in indigenous firing practices, not only in Australia, but projects that have examined firing practices in North America and elsewhere to try to look at the common themes and come up with recommendations. So, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so very, very much. And I'm very glad you brought up Lionel and Ali Ackerman, because they reminded us, both of them visited Calcutta in 2015 at our university. So it was a wonderful association. So I'm very grateful that we could meet here in the first place. So thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you for your questions, man. Thank you.
So can I tell something?
Please, yes.
So it's not a question as such, but it's my sense of appreciation to the University College and to Dr. Suja for having introduced you to us, because we had undertaken a project. I had undertaken a project with one of my MA students based on Richard Power's The Overstory, wherein I had used your book, The Language of Plants, as a framework. So to meet the author of that book has been a wonderful occasion, and this is just to express our appreciation for to Suja Miss and also to University College for having brought such a great personality over here. Thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you for the comment. And for those of you who may not know about Richard Powers' The Overstory, it was published in 2018, and it's a book that's really causing a kind of renaissance in knowledge of plants. There's been a lot of scientific research, especially in the last 2 decades, about how plants communicate, how they behave, how they even have a form of memory. And so what Powers did was study all of that and interview also Suzanne Simard, who's a major scientist in this area of research. And then he put together this fictional narrative that's won a number of major prizes, and really helped to popularize the concept of what's known in scientific circles as plant cognition. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that book.
Dr. Ryan,
Yes.
and all the participants, I'd like to share with you I would like to share with you the feeling of happiness and gratitude towards you for introducing us to the updated version of Australian Aboriginal poetry and framing it against the backdrop of eco-poetics. So that is a wonderful experience. And I would also like to convey the idea that we have a few research scholars at the Center for Australian Studies working on climate change fiction, And then the most recent addition was a person called, a student called Nitin Lal, who has started working towards certain aspects in Australian climate change plays. So at our center and at the University of Kerala, we are much interested in Australian studies, and that too different facets of Australian studies. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, it's great to know of your work. I'm very happy to learn of the work of the Center for Australian Studies, and yeah, I think it's so important to promote exchange between Australian scholars, and Australian scholars in India and Australia and elsewhere. So, yeah, thank you so much.
So before moving on to the formal vote of thanks, from my personal behalf, I would like to once again thank you. And I also look forward to more fruitful associations with Southern Cross University and with great academicians like you. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Professor. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks everyone for attending today. Please keep in touch. I look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan and Dr. Suja. Now I invite Dr. Chitra VR, Assistant Professor of English, University College, and the Organizing Secretary of this international conference to formally propose a vote of thanks.
Once again,
To have you.
I think you have to repeat it.
Am I audible?
Let me start from the beginning. Am I audible?
Thank you so much for that illuminating talk, Dr. Ryan. We are genuinely privileged and honored to have you as keynote speaker of this event. But let me first express my sincere thanks to you on my own behalf and on behalf of the postgraduate and the research department of University College and our academic collaborators, Center for Australian Studies, LITCRIT and ISA. I'm sure many scholars, that is scholars working in critical plant studies and environmental humanities must have gained valuable insights from your enriching talk. As you have rightly remarked in your lecture, culture influences how fire is perceived and managed in societies. A catastrophic wildfire engages our attention all the more. In keeping with what you have said in your seminal work, Introduction to Environmental Humanities, indigenous knowledge systems that are often more experiential, localized, and holistic promote an understanding of complex ecological processes. The key takeaway of your talk is that narratives of resilience and survival, especially poetry, has got an inherent potential to emerge and transform ecological imagination, and also to provide alternative sustainable living. And this becomes all the more relevant in the wake of COVID situation, when COVID-19 is still continuing to haunt our collective consciousness. Being a poet, you have remarked that to see is to see, to be seen, to affect is to be affected. I think this becomes the tagline of our conference, and this is going to anchor our debates and discussions in the remaining hours of our conference. Thank you, Dr. Ryan, once again for that wonderful talk, and thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and my pleasure. Thank you so much for your comments.
We have come to the end of this session. Kindly join us in the next session scheduled at 1 p.m. using the link provided for paper presentations. Thank you.